If Israel is God's chosen people, why did he let Iran become their enemy? To find a biblical perspective, we must journey back, not to the headlines of today, but to the dust and clay of the ancient world. Our story doesn't begin with conflict, but with a promise. It begins with a whisper on the Mesopotamian wind, a divine call to a man named Abram, who lived in Ur of the Chaldees. The voice of God pierced the veil of the ordinary, offering a covenant that would echo through millennia. "Leave your country, your people and your father's household," the voice commanded, "and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." This was not merely a contract. It was the birth of a destiny, a covenant etched into the very fabric of time. Abraham, as he would come to be known, obeyed. He stepped out in faith, his gaze fixed not on what he was leaving behind, but on the promise of a future, a land, a people as countless as the stars in the night sky, and a divine relationship that would set his descendants apart from all other nations on earth. This was the foundation of Israel's chosenness, an act of sovereign grace, a unilateral promise from the Creator of the universe. Centuries later, that promise had blossomed. The descendants of Abraham were now a multitude, freed from the chains of slavery in Egypt by a spectacular display of divine power. At the foot of a mountain that trembled and smoked, God met with them again. He met with them through Moses. Here, the covenant was given its form, its laws, its responsibilities. On Mount Sinai, amidst fire and thunder, the promise was paired with a condition. God laid out two paths with stark, terrifying clarity. The path of obedience would lead to unimaginable blessing. "If you fully obey the Lord your God," the covenant declared, "the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations on earth. The Lord will grant that the enemies who rise up against you will be defeated before you. The Lord will open the heavens, the storehouse of his bounty, to send rain on your land in season and to bless all the work of your hands." It was a vision of paradise on earth, a kingdom of priests, a beacon of divine light to the world. But there was another path, the path of disobedience. The warnings were as severe as the blessings were sweet. "However, if you do not obey the Lord your God, cursed you will be in the city, and cursed you will be in the country. The sky over your head will be bronze, the ground beneath you iron. The Lord will bring a nation against you from far away, from the ends of the earth, like an eagle swooping down, a nation whose language you will not understand, a ruthless nation. They will lay siege to all the cities throughout your land until the high fortified walls in which you trust fall down." The covenant was a double-edged sword, a source of unparalleled blessing, but also a standard of judgment. For generations, Israel wrestled with this duality. They conquered the promised land, they built a nation, and under King David and his son Solomon, their kingdom shone with a brilliance that dazzled the ancient world. Solomon's temple stood in Jerusalem, a breathtaking testament of stone and gold, its inner sanctum, the Holy of Holies, housing the Ark of the Covenant, the very symbol of God's presence on earth. For a time it seemed the blessings of Sinai were an eternal reality, but the memory of the mountain grew faint. The whispers of foreign gods, the Baals and Asherahs of their neighbors, became seductive songs. Kings who were meant to be shepherds of the people became wolves, leading them into idolatry. Altars to pagan deities were built on the high places, casting profane shadows over the land promised to Abraham. The laws of the covenant, which demanded justice for the poor and mercy for the orphan, were trampled underfoot. The cries of the oppressed went unheard in the courts, drowned out by the clinking of corrupt gold. God did not remain silent. He sent his prophets, men like Isaiah and Jeremiah, whose hearts broke for their people. Their voices were thunder in the streets of Jerusalem, pleading, warning, weeping. Jeremiah walked through the city, his words a torrent of grief and impending doom. "Oh, that my head were a spring of water, and my eyes a fountain of tears. I would weep day and night for the slain of my people," he cried. He warned them that their beloved city, their impenetrable walls, their magnificent temple would not save them from the consequences of their broken covenant. They had trusted in the symbols of their religion but had abandoned the God of it. Their pleas were dismissed as madness. Their warnings were scorned as treason. The people and their leaders, deafened by pride, believed they were invincible. They were the chosen people. The temple was God's dwelling place. Surely he would never let it fall. They were wrong. The judgment prophesied at Sinai arrived, not as a whisper, but as a storm from the north. The Babylonian Empire, under the command of the ruthless King Nebuchadnezzar, was the instrument of God's discipline. The Bible calls him God's servant for this terrible task. The Babylonian army was a relentless, earth-shaking force. The glint of bronze helmets and the sharp points of a forest of spears appeared on the horizon, a tide of destruction about to break upon the walls of Jerusalem. The siege was long and brutal. Hope withered into starvation. The laughter of children was replaced by the silence of hunger. Finally, in the year 586 BC, the walls were breached. The Babylonian soldiers poured into the city like a flood, their shouts of victory mixing with the screams of the dying. They showed no mercy. They torched the homes, tore down the palaces, and marched to the holy mountain. There they laid waste to the most sacred place on earth. Solomon's temple, the heart of Israel's faith, the symbol of God's presence, was looted and set ablaze. The great cedar beams cracked and fell in showers of sparks. The gold melted and ran like tears down the scorched stone. The Holy of Holies was violated, its veil torn, its sacredness desecrated. The city of David, the beacon of light, was reduced to a smoldering ruin. The survivors, the elite, the craftsmen, the strong, were chained together and led away. They began the long, sorrowful march into a foreign land, their backs to the smoking embers of their home, their faces toward a future of exile. By the rivers of Babylon they would sit down and weep, remembering Zion. The promise to Abraham felt like a distant, broken dream. The covenant of Sinai had delivered its curse. God's chosen people were now captives in a strange land, their God seemingly silent, their hope utterly extinguished. It was in this profound darkness, this absolute despair, that the stage was set for an answer to their prayers from the most unexpected of sources. Decades bled into one another under the hot Babylonian sun. A generation was born in captivity, their only knowledge of Jerusalem coming from the hushed, tearful stories of their elders. They lived and worked beside the great canals, the Chebar and the Euphrates, their hands helping to build the magnificent pagan city that held them prisoner. The sheer scale of Babylon was meant to crush the spirit. The Ishtar Gate, with its brilliant blue-glazed bricks and terrifying dragons, was a daily reminder of the power of the gods of their captors. The ziggurat, the Tower of Babel's heir, clawed at the sky, a monument to human pride. To the exiled Jews it was a symbol of their desolation. Yet, in the quiet corners of their homes, a flicker of hope was kept alive. It was not a hope in their own strength, for they had none. It was a hope kindled by ancient words, carefully preserved on fragile scrolls. In the quarters of the aging prophet Daniel, a man who had served in the courts of Babylonian kings but whose heart remained in Jerusalem, these scrolls were more precious than life itself. Night after night, by the dim light of an oil lamp, he would unroll the writings of the prophets who had come before him. He would often turn to the prophet Isaiah. His fingers, thin and weathered, would trace over words that seemed impossible, almost fantastical. They were words written over a century and a half before, when Babylon was not yet the world's master and the Persian kingdom was little more than a collection of nomadic tribes. Yet, Isaiah had written with breathtaking certainty, "This is what the Lord says to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I take hold of to subdue nations before him and to strip kings of their armor, to open doors before him so that gates will not be shut. I will go before you and will level the mountains. I will break down gates of bronze and cut through bars of iron. I will give you the treasures of darkness, riches stored in secret places, so that you may know that I am the Lord, the God of Israel, who summons you by name. For the sake of Jacob my servant, of Israel my chosen, I summon you by name and bestow on you a title of honor, though you do not acknowledge me. Cyrus, a name, a specific name, plucked from the future by the God of eternity. Reading these words in the heart of Babylon felt like an act of rebellion. To the world, Nebuchadnezzar and his successors were the arbiters of destiny. But to Daniel and the faithful remnant, these scrolls declared that a higher power was at work. God had not abandoned them. He was merely setting the stage. He had a plan, and that plan had a name. While the Jews prayed and waited, a new wind began to blow from the east. From the mountainous lands of Persia, a leader of unprecedented genius emerged. His name was Cyrus. He was a master strategist, a brilliant general, but he was something the ancient world had rarely seen. He was a unifier. When he conquered the Medes, he did not enslave them, he integrated them, forming the mighty Medo-Persian Empire. His reputation preceded him. He was not a brutal tyrant who left a trail of pyramids of skulls, like the Assyrians before him. He was seen by many conquered peoples as a liberator, a ruler who respected local customs and religions. This was the man Isaiah had called God's shepherd, the one who would accomplish his will. The empire of Babylon, in its arrogance, failed to see the storm gathering on its borders. The current king, Belshazzar, was a pale shadow of his ancestor Nebuchadnezzar. He was weak, decadent, and consumed by his own pleasure. On one fateful night, as the Persian army massed silently outside the city walls, Belshazzar decided to host a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles. In a final act of supreme hubris, he gave a drunken command: "Bring the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar my father took from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines, may drink from them." The sacred vessels, consecrated for the worship of the one true God, were filled with wine. As the pagan lords raised them to their lips in praise of their gods of gold and silver, of bronze and iron, of wood and stone, a hush fell over the great hall. A new light appeared, colder and more terrifying than any lamp. From the air itself, the fingers of a human hand materialized. They moved with an unearthly grace across the plaster of the palace wall, writing. The king's face turned pale, his knees knocked together, and his legs gave way. The laughter died, replaced by a collective gasp of terror. The message was clear for all to see, but none of the king's wise men could interpret it. Only one man could. Daniel, the old Jewish exile, was summoned. He stood before the terrified king, his gaze firm, and read the verdict of God Almighty. Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. That very night, the prophecy was fulfilled. While Belshazzar and his court were paralyzed by fear, Cyrus's engineers had accomplished the impossible. They had diverted the course of the mighty Euphrates River, which flowed through the center of Babylon. The water level dropped, allowing the Persian soldiers to march silently into the city through the riverbed, under the massive walls that were thought to be impenetrable. The gates of bronze were not broken down, they were simply opened from within. The city fell not with a roar, but with a whisper. Belshazzar, the blasphemous king, was slain. When dawn broke, a new flag flew over the ramparts of Babylon. Cyrus the Great rode into the city not as a destroyer, but as a master. The Jews, huddling in their homes, expected a new and perhaps harsher form of slavery. What happened next was beyond their wildest dreams. A few months later, in the first year of his reign, King Cyrus issued a proclamation that was sent throughout his vast empire. The Jewish elders were summoned to the royal court. They stood, trembling, before the most powerful man in the world, the man Isaiah had named. A scribe unrolled a scroll and began to read the king's decree. This is what Cyrus, king of Persia, says: "The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judah. Any of his people among you may go up to Jerusalem in Judah and build the temple of the Lord, the God of Israel, the God who is in Jerusalem, and may their God be with them. And in any locality where survivors may now be living, the people are to provide them with silver and gold, with goods and livestock, and with free will offerings for the temple of God in Jerusalem. A stunned silence filled the air, broken only by a soft gasp, then a sob. It was a sound of disbelief melting into overwhelming cathartic joy. Tears streamed down the faces of the old men who had dreamed of this day but never truly believed they would see it. They were not just being released, they were being sent home. They were not just being tolerated, they were being commissioned, funded by the very empire that had conquered their conquerors. The hand of God, which had written a verdict on the wall of a Babylonian palace, had now written a decree of deliverance on the heart of a Persian king. The nation of Persia, the modern-day Iran, did not enter Israel's story as a foe. It entered as the chosen instrument of God's redemption, the shepherd sent from the east to gather a scattered flock and lead them home. The decree of Cyrus swept through the Jewish communities scattered across Babylon like a wildfire of hope. For 70 long years, next year in Jerusalem had been a sorrowful prayer, a whispered longing for a home most had never seen. Now it was a royal command, a tangible reality. The news was met with an explosion of joyous disbelief. People wept in the streets, embracing strangers who were suddenly brothers and sisters united in a shared destiny. It was, as the psalmist would later write, like a dream. Their mouths were filled with laughter, their tongues with songs of joy. The preparations began immediately. It was a monumental undertaking, an exodus in reverse. Families who had lived in Babylon for generations began to sort through their belongings, deciding what to take and what to leave behind. The treasures of a lifetime were packed alongside simple tools, seeds for planting, and most importantly, the sacred scrolls of the law and the prophets. Zerubbabel, a descendant of King David, and Jeshua the high priest were appointed as leaders of the first wave of returnees. They were men of faith and courage, tasked with shepherding nearly 50,000 souls across a harsh and unforgiving landscape. King Cyrus was true to his word. He did more than just grant permission. He actively facilitated the return. He commanded his treasurers to open the royal storehouses and return the sacred vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had plundered from the temple. 5,400 articles of gold and silver basins, pans and goblets that had been defiled in Belshazzar's feast were meticulously catalogued and handed over to Zerubbabel. It was a powerful symbol. The glory of their past was being restored to them, a tangible link to the house of God they were about to rebuild. The Persian government also provided provisions for the journey and letters of safe conduct, ensuring their passage through the various provinces of the empire. The day of departure was a sight to behold. A vast caravan of people, livestock and wagons stretched for miles, a river of humanity flowing out of the city that had been their prison. It was a scene of poignant farewells. Many older Jews, too frail for the arduous journey, stayed behind, blessing their children and grandchildren with tears in their eyes, their hearts torn between the comfort of the familiar and the joy of their people's restoration. A new generation, born in exile, looked ahead with a mixture of excitement and trepidation, their imaginations filled with stories of a golden city and a holy mountain. The journey itself was a crucible. The 4-month trek across the Fertile Crescent was fraught with peril. The heat was relentless, the landscape often barren. They faced the constant threat of bandits who preyed on slow-moving caravans. Nights were spent huddled around fires, with guards posted, listening to the sounds of the desert, their trust placed not in their own numbers, but in the God who had set them free. During these long nights, the elders would recount the stories of their first exodus from Egypt, drawing parallels between the past and the present. They were once again God's redeemed people, marching towards a promised land. Finally, after months of travel, they crested a ridge in the Judean hills, and there it was, Jerusalem. But the sight that greeted them was not the glorious city of their songs and stories. It was a heartbreaking panorama of devastation. A wave of collective grief silenced the weary travelers. The mighty walls Solomon had built were just jagged heaps of stone, overgrown with thorns and briars. The gates were charred husks. Where magnificent palaces had once stood, only foundations remained, creating an eerie, skeletal skyline. The city was sparsely populated by a few poor peasants and foreigners who had drifted into the vacuum left by the exile. Most devastating of all was the sight of the Temple Mount. The holy place, the center of their universe, was a desolate ruin. The great platform was there, but the magnificent Temple of Solomon was gone, replaced by a chaotic pile of rubble and scorched earth. Weeds grew where the Holy of Holies had once stood. The silence of the place was deafening, a testament to God's judgment and their own past sins. The initial elation of their return quickly gave way to the sobering reality of their task. They were a small, relatively poor community in a ruined land, surrounded by neighbors who viewed their arrival with suspicion and hostility. The Edomites to the south, the Samaritans to the north, and other local clans had occupied the lands of the exiled Judeans. They saw this sudden influx of thousands of people, backed by a Persian royal decree, not as a divine act, but as a direct threat to their own power and prosperity. Despite the daunting circumstances, Zerubbabel and Jeshua rallied the people. Their first act, even before building their own homes, was to restore the central point of their faith. On the rubble of the Temple Mount, they cleared a space and, with great ceremony and emotion, rebuilt the altar of the God of Israel. As the first plumes of smoke from the morning and evening sacrifices ascended into the sky for the first time in 70 years, it was a defiant declaration of faith. It was a stake driven into the ground, a claim that God was once again present with his people in this place. They celebrated the Feast of Tabernacles with a joy that was tinged with sorrow, living in makeshift booths amidst the ruins, just as the law commanded. The reading of the Torah echoed through the skeletal city, a sound of life returning to a place long dead. The following year, with the altar established, they laid the foundation of the new temple. It was a moment of profound emotional conflict. As the priests and Levites, dressed in their sacred vestments, sounded the trumpets and cymbals and sang praises to the Lord, a great shout of joy erupted from the younger generation. They were building the future, but at the same time, a sound of loud weeping rose from the older priests, Levites, and family heads, those who had seen the first temple in its glory. For them, this new foundation was so small, so humble, in comparison to the magnificence of Solomon's creation. The sound of joy and the sound of weeping mingled together, a perfect symphony of Israel's state, grateful for their return, but painfully aware of how much they had lost. This public act of rebuilding, however, was the spark that ignited the opposition. The local leaders, the Samaritans, led by men like Sanballat and Tobiah, saw the new foundation and knew their window of influence was closing. Their initial approach was subtle and cunning. They came to Zerubbabel, feigning friendship. "Let us help you build," they said, "because, like you, we seek your God and have been sacrificing to him." Zerubbabel and Jeshua saw through the deception. These were the very people who had populated the land with a syncretistic mixed worship, blending the worship of Yahweh with their pagan traditions. To allow them to participate would be to compromise the purity of the temple from its very foundation, repeating the exact sins that had led to the exile in the first place. Zerubbabel's refusal was firm and unequivocal. "It is not for you and us to build a temple to our God. We alone will build it for the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, commanded us." The friendly mask dropped. The opposition now became open and aggressive. The work was about to become a battle. Zerubbabel's rejection ignited a campaign of systematic opposition that was as relentless as it was insidious. The people of the land, led by the cunning Samaritan governor Sanballat and the influential official Tobiah, shifted their tactics from feigned cooperation to active sabotage. They could not use open warfare against a project sanctioned by the Persian emperor, so they waged a war of attrition, a battle of morale and bureaucracy. They began by intimidating the builders. Small groups of armed men would appear on the hillsides overlooking Jerusalem, their presence a silent, menacing threat. Supply lines were harassed, and workers traveling to and from the city were often robbed or beaten. Fear, like a cold fog, began to seep into the hearts of the returnees. The initial enthusiasm of the foundation-laying ceremony waned under the daily grind of hard labor mixed with constant anxiety. The sound of a hammer striking stone was often answered by the jeers and taunts of their enemies. "What are those feeble Jews doing?" Sanballat would mock loudly. "Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from those heaps of rubble burned as they are?" Their most effective weapon, however, was not the sword, but the whispered lie. They dispatched riders to the regional Persian governors and officials throughout the province beyond the river. They began a sophisticated disinformation campaign, painting the rebuilding of Jerusalem not as a religious project, but as an act of political rebellion. They bribed counselors and officials within the Persian bureaucracy to work against the Jews, to frustrate their plans by burying them in red tape and legal challenges. Letters full of slanderous accusations were sent to the imperial court, which had since moved from Cyrus to his successors. The letter to King Artaxerxes, a successor to Cyrus, was a masterpiece of political poison. It began with feigned loyalty to the throne, then twisted the truth with deadly precision. "Let it be known to the king that the Jews who came up to us from you have gone to Jerusalem and are rebuilding that rebellious and wicked city. They are restoring the walls and repairing the foundations. Furthermore, let it be known to the king that if this city is built and its walls are restored, no more taxes, tribute or duty will be paid, and the royal revenues will suffer. They will set up their own king and rebel against the empire just as they did in the past." History was their weapon. They dredged up the past rebellions of the Judean kings against Babylon and Assyria, reframing them to suggest that sedition was embedded in the very DNA of the Jewish people. The argument was clever, playing on the deepest fears of any imperial power, loss of revenue and political instability on its fringes. In the distant, opulent capital of Susa, far removed from the dusty reality of Judea, the letter had its intended effect. The new king, unfamiliar with Cyrus's original decree and concerned with maintaining control over his vast empire, listened to his advisors. A search was made in the royal archives. The records confirmed that Jerusalem had indeed been a powerful city with strong kings who had once ruled over the entire region. The Samaritan's lie, wrapped in a kernel of historical truth, became believable. The royal response was swift and devastating. A decree was issued from the throne of Persia, the same throne that had once ordered the rebuilding. It commanded an immediate halt to all construction. "Give orders now for these men to stop work, so that this city will not be rebuilt until I so order. Be careful not to neglect this matter. Why let this threat grow, to the detriment of the royal interests?" The Samaritan leaders received the king's letter with triumphant glee. They rode to Jerusalem, not with veiled threats, but with the full authority of the Persian Empire behind them. They brandished the scroll before Zerubbabel and Jeshua, and by force of arms compelled the Jews to stop their work. The silence that fell over the Temple Mount was more profound than the desolation of the exile. This was not a judgment from God for their sins. It felt like a betrayal. They had obeyed. They had returned. They had tried to rebuild. And now the very empire that had been their liberator had become their oppressor. The half-built foundation became a monument to their failure. The weeds began to grow back. Discouragement settled over the community like a shroud. The people scattered, turning their attention from the house of God to their own houses. They paneled their own homes with cedar, while the Lord's house remained a ruin. The spiritual fervor cooled into weary resignation. For nearly 16 years, the work ceased. The dream was dead. It seemed their enemies had won. But God's plan is never confined to a single location or a single project. While the work in Jerusalem languished, a new chapter of his providential care was unfolding in the very heart of the Persian Empire, in the capital city of Susa. It was a drama that began not with kings and priests, but with a young orphaned Jewish girl named Hadassah. Raised by her older cousin Mordecai, a minor official who sat at the king's gate, Hadassah possessed a quiet grace and a breathtaking beauty. When the current king, Xerxes, also known as Ahasuerus, deposed his queen for an act of public disobedience, he launched a search for a new queen from among all the beautiful young virgins of his empire. Mordecai, guided by a sense of foreboding and perhaps a divine nudge he did not fully understand, urged his cousin to enter the contest, but with a critical instruction: she was to conceal her Jewish identity. Hadassah, now known by her Persian name Esther, was taken into the royal palace. Her humility and grace immediately captivated Hegai, the eunuch in charge of the harem. When she was finally brought before King Xerxes, he was utterly enchanted. He loved Esther more than any of the other women, and he set the royal crown on her head and made her his queen. An unknown Jewish orphan was now the most powerful woman in the world, her true identity a secret held between her and her cousin. At the same time, a new figure rose to prominence in Xerxes' court. His name was Haman, a descendant of Agag, the Amalekite king who had been a sworn enemy of Israel centuries before. The Amalekites were the first nation to attack the Israelites after they left Egypt, and God had declared he would be at war with them from generation to generation. A deep, ancient hatred flowed in Haman's veins. Xerxes, in a display of royal favor, elevated Haman above all the other nobles. The king commanded that everyone at the royal gate kneel down and pay honor to Haman. Everyone complied, except for one man, Mordecai, the Jew. He would bow only to his God. Day after day he refused, and his quiet defiance did not go unnoticed. When Haman learned that Mordecai was a Jew, his personal offense morphed into a genocidal rage. He was not content to punish just one man. He would annihilate his entire race. Haman went to the king, his words dripping with the same kind of poison that had stopped the work in Jerusalem. There is a certain people dispersed and scattered among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom, whose customs are different from those of all other people, and who do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. He offered an enormous Bribiton 1,000 talents of silver to finance the project. Xerxes, careless and detached, took his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman, the enemy of the Jews. "Keep the money," the king said, "and do with the people as you see fit." With the king's ring, Haman's decree was unstoppable. A date was set by the casting of lots, the pur, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar. On that day, in every province of the Persian Empire, from India to Ethiopia, all Jews young and old, women and children were to be destroyed, killed and annihilated, and their property plundered. The decree was sent by courier to every corner of the empire. As the king and Haman sat down to drink, the city of Susa was bewildered, but in the Jewish quarters a cry of terror and anguish arose. The greatest threat Israel had ever faced had not come from an external army, but from a whispered lie in the ear of the king. It was a sentence of death, sealed by the unalterable law of the Medes and Persians. The fate of God's chosen people now rested on the shoulders of a young queen who did not even know if she would survive her next audience with her husband, the king. When the royal decree, sealed with the king's signet ring, was proclaimed in the streets of Susa, a wave of cold terror washed over the Jewish community. The words were unambiguous and absolute. A date was set for their complete and utter annihilation. Mordecai, upon hearing the news, tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and walked through the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. His grief was not his alone. It was the voice of a people condemned. Throughout the provinces, wherever the edict reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Their hope, which had been rekindled by Cyrus, was now extinguished by the stroke of a pen from his successor. Esther, insulated within the perfumed walls of the palace, was unaware of the catastrophe. When her servants told her of Mordecai's public display of grief, she was deeply distressed. She sent clothes for him to wear, but he refused them. The sackcloth was not a garment, it was a statement. Puzzled and alarmed, Esther sent one of the king's trusted eunuchs, Hathach, to find out what was troubling her cousin. Through Hathach, Mordecai revealed everything. He explained Haman's wicked plot and the exact amount of money he had promised to pay for the destruction of the Jews. He gave Hathach a copy of the written decree to show Esther, and he charged her with a terrifying mission. She was to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. The message struck Esther with the force of a physical blow. The blood drained from her face. She knew the law of the palace, a law that applied even to the queen. Any person, man or woman, who approached the king in the inner court without being summoned was to be put to death. There was only one exception. If the king extended the golden scepter, that person's life would be spared. And Esther sent back to Mordecai. The king had not called for her in 30 days. Her favor with him was uncertain. To approach him unbidden was to gamble with her life. Mordecai's reply was swift, sharp, and it cut through Esther's fear, piercing her heart with the weight of destiny. It was a message that would echo through the ages. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? His words transformed her perspective. This was no longer about her survival, it was about her purpose. Her elevation to queen was not a stroke of luck or a fairy tale romance. It was an act of divine providence, a strategic placement by the unseen hand of God for this very moment, this impossible crisis. The choice was hers. She could try to save her own life and be lost to history, or she could risk her life to become the instrument of her people's salvation. Esther's fear did not vanish, but it was now overshadowed by a resolute courage. She sent her final reply to Mordecai. Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa, and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. For 3 days, a spiritual battle was waged in Susa. The Jews fasted and prayed, their collective plea ascending to the God of their fathers. In the palace, Esther did the same, preparing her spirit for what was to come. On the 3rd day she arose. She put on her royal robes, each thread a prayer, each jewel a petition. She did not approach the king's throne room timidly, but stood in the inner court, in full view of the hall where King Xerxes was seated on his royal throne. He saw her. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, the fate of a nation hung in the balance. The king's gaze rested upon her. Would he see an intruder violating his law, or would he see the woman he loved? A smile touched his lips. He was pleased with her. He held out the golden scepter that was in his hand. Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter, her life spared. What is it, Queen Esther? The king asked, his voice warm. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given you. Instead of blurting out her desperate plea, Esther, guided by a divine wisdom, made a simple, disarming request. If it pleases the king, she replied, let the king, together with Haman, come today to a banquet I have prepared for him. Haman was ecstatic. To be singled out, along with the king, for a private banquet with the queen was the ultimate honor. He left the palace that day with a happy heart, his chest puffed with pride. But as he passed through the king's gate, he saw Mordecai, and Mordecai still did not rise or show him fear. Haman's joy instantly curdled into rage. He went home and, after boasting to his wife and friends about his wealth and his unique favor with the king and queen, he confessed that all of it meant nothing to him as long as he saw Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. His wife Zeresh and his friends offered a simple, brutal solution. Have a gallows built, 75 feet high, and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go with the king to the banquet and be happy. The idea delighted Haman. He had the massive gallows constructed immediately, a towering monument to his hatred, silhouetted against the night sky. But God's providence works even in the sleepless nights of pagan kings. That night, King Xerxes could not sleep. He commanded that the book of the Chronicles, the official record of his reign, be brought and read to him. As a scribe droned on, he read an entry about how Mordecai had uncovered a plot by two of the king's officers to assassinate him, thus saving the king's life. "What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this?" the king asked. "Nothing has been done for him," his attendants answered. Just then a sound was heard in the outer court. "Who is in the court?" the king asked. It was Haman. He had come early, bursting with eagerness to ask the king's permission to hang Mordecai on the gallows he had just built. "Let him enter," the king commanded. When Haman came in, the king, his mind on Mordecai, asked him a question. What should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Haman's heart soared. Who could the king possibly want to honor more than him? He let his imagination run wild, describing the most lavish public ceremony he could conceive. "For the man the king delights to honor," he said, "have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor, and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, 'This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Go at once.'" And the king commanded Haman, the words hitting him like a physical blow. "Get the robe and the horse, and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended." Humiliated, his world turned upside down, Haman had no choice but to obey. He took the royal robe and the horse, found his mortal enemy, and dressed him in the king's own splendor. Haman, the second most powerful man in the empire, then had to lead the horse of his hated rival through the city square, shouting out the proclamation of Mordecai's honor for all to hear. The public spectacle of his triumph had become the public stage for his deepest shame. After this, he rushed home, his head covered in grief, the gallows he had built standing as a silent, ironic monument to his folly. The stage was now perfectly set for Esther's final move. Haman returned to his home, not in triumph, but in utter disgrace. He recounted the soul-crushing humiliation to his wife Zeresh and his friends. The arrogant confidence they had displayed the night before had vanished, replaced by a sudden, chilling premonition. Zeresh, who had so eagerly suggested the gallows, now spoke with a sense of prophetic dread. "Since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin," she said, "you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin." Even as she spoke, the king's eunuchs arrived. There was no time to process his shame or his fear. It was time for Queen Esther's second banquet. Haman composed himself as best he could and followed them back to the palace, his mind reeling. The day had begun with him expecting to arrange his enemy's execution. It was ending with him as the guest of honor at the queen's table, fresh from having publicly honored that same enemy. The banquet was an intimate affair, just the king, the queen, and Haman. The food was exquisite, the wine fragrant and plentiful. King Xerxes was in high spirits, but he was also consumed by curiosity. He knew Esther had risked her life to see him, and he knew her request for 2 banquets was merely a prelude to her true petition. As they were drinking wine, he leaned toward her once more. "Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." The moment had come. All the fasting, all the prayer, all the courage had led to this. Esther took a breath, her gaze meeting the king's. Her voice was steady, but it carried the weight of a condemned people. "If I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life, this is my petition, and spare my people, this is my request." The king was stunned. "Your life? Spare your people?" He sat upright, his brow furrowed in confusion and growing anger. Who is he? Where is the man who has dared to do such a thing? He looked around the room as if expecting an assassin to leap from the shadows. Who would dare threaten the life of his queen? Esther's gaze did not waver. She raised her hand and pointed a trembling but resolute finger directly at the third person at the table. An adversary and enemy, this vile Haman. The accusation hung in the air, electric and deadly. The color drained from Haman's face. He was paralyzed with terror. The king, his friend and confidant, was now revealed as the architect of a plot to murder his beloved wife. Xerxes leaped to his feet in a rage, his mind struggling to process the depth of the betrayal. Overwhelmed, he stormed out of the room and into the palace garden to clear his head. Left alone with the queen, Haman knew his life was over. In a desperate, pathetic plea for mercy, he fell upon the couch where Esther was reclining. At that exact moment, the king re-entered the room. The sight that met his eyes, Haman sprawled over the queen, sent him into a fresh paroxysm of fury. He saw not a plea for mercy, but an assault. "Will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house?" Xerxes roared. As the words left the king's mouth, the royal guards, knowing the protocol, moved instantly and covered Haman's face. It was a sign that he was condemned, that he would never again see the light of the king's countenance. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, saw his moment. He knew of the gallows. "A gallows 75 feet high stands by Haman's house," he said. He had it made for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king. The king's response was swift and ironclad. The poetic justice was too perfect to ignore. "Hang him on it," he commanded. So they took Haman and hanged him on the very gallows he had prepared for Mordecai, and only then did the king's fury subside. The immediate threat was eliminated, but the greater problem remained. Haman was dead, but his decree, sealed with the king's signet ring, was still the law of the land. According to the unalterable law of the Medes and Persians, a royal edict could not be revoked. The date for the legally sanctioned genocide of the Jewish people was still on the calendar. That same day, King Xerxes gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman. Esther then revealed her relationship to Mordecai, who was summoned before the king. Xerxes took off his signet ring, the same one he had given to Haman, and placed it on Mordecai's finger. Mordecai, the man who had sat in sackcloth at the king's gate, was now the second most powerful man in the Persian Empire. Esther, however, was not finished. She fell again at the king's feet, weeping, and begged him to put an end to the evil plan of Haman. "The decree is still in effect," she pleaded. "How can I bear to see disaster fall on my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my family?" The king, moved by her tears and now fully understanding the gravity of the situation, confirmed the terrible legal bind they were in. "I cannot repeal the edict," he explained. "But," he said, turning to Esther and Mordecai, "you may write another decree in the king's name in behalf of the Jews as seems best to you, and seal it with the king's signet ring." It was a brilliant legal workaround. They could not cancel the first decree, but they could issue a second, counter-decree. Royal scribes were immediately summoned. Mordecai dictated the new edict. It was a message of defiance and empowerment. It granted the Jews in every city of the empire the right to assemble and protect themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate any armed force of any nationality or province that might attack them and their women and children, and to plunder the property of their enemies. This new decree was written, sealed with the king's ring, and sent by couriers on the fastest royal horses to all 127 provinces, from India to Kush. Mordecai left the king's presence that day wearing royal garments of blue and white, a large crown of gold, and a purple robe of fine linen. The city of Susa, which had been bewildered by the first decree, now erupted in celebration. For the Jewish people, the news was a miracle. When the edict arrived in each province and city, there was joy and gladness, a feast and a celebration. The darkness of their death sentence was replaced by the brilliant light of hope and the authorization to defend their lives. Their fear was transformed into courage. A great reversal had taken place, orchestrated by the God who works behind the scenes, turning the schemes of evil men upside down, and using the courage of a faithful few to deliver his people from the brink of extinction. The day once marked for their sorrow was now destined to become a day of their greatest victory. The day arrived, the 13th day of the month of Adar. It was the day Haman's lottery had chosen for the destruction of the Jews, the day their enemies had eagerly awaited to settle old scores and seize their property. But because of Mordecai's counter-decree, the tables had been completely turned. Throughout the Persian Empire, the Jews assembled in their cities, not as victims waiting for slaughter, but as an organized, empowered force ready to defend their lives. A great fear of them had fallen on the surrounding peoples. The authority of Mordecai was now known throughout the land, and all the nobles, satraps, governors, and royal officials actively helped the Jews because fear of Mordecai had seized them. On that day, the Jews struck down their enemies with the sword, slaughtering and destroying them. They did as they pleased with those who hated them. In the citadel of Susa alone, they struck down 500 men. But in a profound testament to their motives, they did not lay a hand on the plunder. Their fight was for survival, not for profit. When the king was told of the outcome, he was impressed. He gave Esther a further opportunity to secure her people, and at her request, the 10 sons of Haman were hanged on the gallows, a final public statement that Haman's wicked legacy was finished. The fighting continued for a second day in Susa, and throughout the provinces the Jews defended themselves, gaining relief from their enemies. The day that was meant to be their darkest became their greatest victory. To commemorate this incredible deliverance, Mordecai established the festival of Purim, a time of feasting, joy, and giving gifts to the poor, a perpetual reminder of how God had turned their mourning into dancing. The story of Esther is a masterclass in divine providence. God's name is never mentioned in the entire book, yet his fingerprints are all over it. A sleepless king, a convenient reading from the Chronicles, a perfectly timed entrance, a queen placed in power for such a time as this. In the heart of the Persian capital, God demonstrated that he could protect his people even when they were far from their land and their temple. He showed that he could turn the heart of a pagan king and use the structures of a foreign empire not just to tolerate his people, but to actively protect and empower them. And while this high-stakes drama unfolded in Susa, what of the forgotten half-built temple in Jerusalem? News of these events traveled slowly, but it traveled. The story of Mordecai's rise to power, of Haman's fall, and of the king's new and profound favor toward the Jewish people would have eventually reached the beleaguered community in Judea. But something else was stirring, something more direct. The spiritual paralysis that had gripped Jerusalem for 16 years was about to be broken. God raised up 2 new voices among the ruins. The first was Haggai, an old prophet, practical and direct. He walked among the people, who were living in their comfortable paneled houses, and he asked a searing question. Is it a time for you yourselves to be living in your paneled houses, while this house, the temple, remains a ruin? Give careful thought to your ways. You have planted much but harvested little. You eat, but never have enough. You drink, but never have your fill. Because of my house, which remains a ruin, while each of you is busy with your own house. His words struck a nerve. He connected their economic hardships directly to their spiritual apathy. At the same time, the younger prophet Zechariah began to speak, his words filled with soaring, apocalyptic visions of a glorious future for Jerusalem, a city with God in its midst, protected not by walls of stone, but by a wall of fire. He reminded them of God's passionate love for them, reigniting the hope that had been extinguished. Inspired by this divine tag team of prophecy, Zerubbabel and Jeshua were moved to action. They rose up and, in an act of faith-filled defiance, began the work on the house of God once more. Immediately, the opposition resurfaced. Tattenai, the governor of the province beyond the river, and his officials rode to Jerusalem. Who authorized you to rebuild this temple and restore this structure? They demanded. But this time, something was different. The Bible notes a crucial detail. The eye of their God was watching over the elders of the Jews, and they were not stopped. Tattenai, unlike his predecessors, was a fair and by-the-book administrator. Instead of just trying to shut them down, he wrote a formal letter to the new king Darius, who had succeeded Xerxes. His letter was purely factual. It reported that the Jews claimed to be acting on an original decree from King Cyrus. He requested that a search be made in the royal archives in Babylon to see if such a decree existed. And so, a search was made, and there, not in Babylon but in the archives at Ecbatana, the summer capital, a scroll was found. On it was the memorandum of Cyrus the Great's original decree, ordering the rebuilding of the temple, and even specifying that the cost was to be paid from the royal treasury. King Darius's response was even more stunning than Cyrus's had been. He issued a new decree. Not only were Tattenai and his officials to stay away from Jerusalem, they were to actively help the Jews. The full cost of the construction was to be paid without delay from the royal treasury. They were to provide the priests with whatever they needed for the daily sacrifices: young bulls, rams, lambs, wheat, salt, wine, and oil. And then Darius added a clause that showed the profound impact of the Jews' witness. He commanded that they offer sacrifices and pray for the well-being of the king and his sons. Finally, he added a terrifying warning. Anyone who altered his edict was to have a beam pulled from his own house and be impaled on it, and his house was to be made a pile of rubble. The very empire that had been used to halt the work was now, by God's sovereign hand, threatening to destroy anyone who stood in the way of its completion. With royal protection, imperial funding, and prophetic encouragement, the work on the temple was completed in just 4 years. 20 years after they had first laid the foundation, the house of God was dedicated with great joy. The Passover was celebrated. The heart of Israel's worship was restored. So we return to our question. If Israel is God's chosen people, why did he allow ancient Persia to become their enemy? The biblical answer is resounding. He didn't. The story, woven through the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, paints a radically different picture. God used Babylon as the rod of his discipline for Israel's unfaithfulness, an act of judgment foretold in their covenant. But he used Persia as the staff of his restoration. He used a Persian king, Cyrus, whom he named 150 years in advance, to be his shepherd, to release his people from captivity and commission the rebuilding of his house. He used a Persian queen, Esther, to be his hidden instrument, to save his people from annihilation from within the empire, turning a plot of genocide into a great victory. He used Persian kings, Darius and Artaxerxes, to fund the temple, protect the workers, and provide for the sacrifices, ensuring the restoration of worship in Jerusalem. The animosity between the modern state of Israel and the Islamic Republic of Iran is a product of 20th and 21st century geopolitics, ideology, and history. It is a modern conflict. To read it back into the Bible is to misread the story entirely. The biblical narrative shows a sovereign God who, in his great love for his chosen people, used a mighty pagan empire not as an enemy, but as an unwitting and powerful ally in his grand, unfolding plan of redemption.